Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis blog. I think this episode is going to be a very controversial one and a rather unpopular one among many. A lot of people are going to feel pissed off by what I am about to say. After having done this particular work for the last 22 years, after having done a lot of lectures, seminars, quite a bit of mentoring, I've concluded that doing change work, coaching, psychotherapy, is above most people's heads. I think most people who do therapy, coaching, and psychotherapy are not really equipped to be doing these professions. And I think the world would likely be way better off if they didn't. Now, when I say not equipped, I'm not talking about formal education. I'm not talking about credentials. I would include most psychologists, psychiatrists, medical doctors, nurses in the exact same category as well. Why am I making this claim? And what is the basis for this seemingly preposterous claim? Now, I have a background in martial arts and in functional self-defense training. So if you focus on martial arts and sport martial arts for a moment, let's say that you were to train a kickboxer for fighting competition, right? You could teach that person to throw jabs and hooks and teach them how to check a leg kick, or to throw a knee strike and do all these sorts of things. But unless the person has a particular set of attributes, the person won't be able to really pull it off. Meaning, unless the person has the speed, the power, the endurance, the grit, the toughness, the ability to take a shot, there's so many qualities that you need to be able to utilize those particular techniques to begin with. Now, if we translate this a little bit over to the change work arena, yes, you need a functional framework. You need particular skills to be able to do effective change work. But I would make the argument that that's not all that you need. I would make the argument that you need a certain way of selfing, a certain capacity for self-reflection, clear, solid boundaries, insight, ability to make distinctions that a lot of research suggests is above most people's heads. So what I'm going to bring up here is something that the developmental psychologist Robert Keegan calls a self-authoring mind, or a self-authoring self, or meaning-making system. Now, this is quoting Keegan. Let's take a look at what this actually refers to. So this is the criteria that Robert Keegan offers for self-authorship. So to be able to perceive our standards as based on our own experience rather than upon the attitudes or desires of others. Perceive ourselves as evaluators of experience rather than regarding ourselves as existing in a world where the values are inherent in and attached to the object of our perceptions. Place the standards within ourselves, recognizing that the goodness or badness of any experience or perpetual object is not something inherent in that object, but a value that we place on it. Transform our energies from manipulating the environment into developing greater and greater self-support. Learn to stand on our own feet emotionally intellectually, and economically. Learn to stop indoctrinating ourselves with the philosophies and values we imbibed in youth. Learn to challenge and question our own basic values and our own thinking so that we really think for ourselves. Take responsibility for our lives. Learn the psychological myths or scripts that govern our behavior and re-author them for better insight of why the script is as it is. That's quite a list, huh? Like how many of the people you know who operate in these sorts of professions seem to embody and consistently live from being able to have these qualities? Now, how and why does this matter? Well, let's take a look at, I'll use Robert Keegan's model of adult developmental psychology as kind of a reference here. I've studied other models as well, ego development, the work of Claire Graves, spiral dynamics. I think Keegan's model is a very useful model for the type of stuff that we do. Now get this, there's no such thing as a self, right? There's no entity in here that's doing the thinking. The self is more a verb than a noun, right? So it would be more realistic to talk about it as selfing, the activity of selfing. So selfing is created by the thought process. It's not that the thought process is created by a self. The thought process creates a self. We could say that thought itself is the thinker. Now, developmentally, at various stages of our psychological development, whatever thought doesn't look like a thought usually looks like a self. So the thoughts that we're not quite able to see as thoughts very easily look like who we are. Like we are identical to a blend of cognitions and emotions and sensations. And it looks as if we are that as a result of not quite being able to see those thoughts as thoughts to begin with. Now, let me throw in a couple of terms here so that I can be as clear as I can possibly be. When I use the term subject in this context, I mean that which experiences something, right? When I use the term object, I'm referring to that which is experienced. So at any stage of development, there's going to be ideas and assumptions that you're subject to. Essentially, these ideas have you. You're a mouthpiece for them. You're kind of like a tool for the assumptions. And there's going to be other ideas and assumptions that you have, meaning you can see them as ideas. You can utilize them. You can have a relationship to them, and therefore you can take them as objects. So I'll give you a very classical, this is like a textbook example of it, but I used to have a friend who took his two kids to the London Eye many years ago, and one of the kids was, I think, 3 and one was 7, something like that. And the young kid said, you know, Dad, look at those small people. And then the older brother says, ah, you idiot, it just looks that way, or something to that effect. So the young child who's subject to his perceptions or impulses fully, if you take them up in the air, you know, on the London Eye or on an airplane, they're likely to say, look at those small people, right? Or if you turn the lights off, the world literally disappears. Where you can play these kind of like peekaboo games with them. And due to them not seeing themselves, they have no cognition that you can still see them, right? So a young child whose thinking is very magical and which doesn't have durable categories is a self system where the person is subject to his or her perceptions or impulses. So this young child, for example, so if we contrast it with a child who's able to take those perceptions and impulses as object to some extent, that person is able to say, okay, because we're up in the air, the people look smaller, but they're not really smaller. They have the category of durable objects. Or because I close my eyes and can't see myself like this, you can still see me, right? So once you get the notion that of durable categories, and you get some ability to take your perceptions as objects, you can begin to see that other people can know things that you can't. So now you have the psychological capacity to deliberately lie, for example, which is a developmental milestone or accomplishment, if you will. So at any stage of development, then, what's subject at one stage of development is going to become object to the subject at the next stage of development. Sounds like a handful, so I'll say it again. What's subject at one stage of development, meaning the ideas that have us, that we don't have any perspective on, that look like us, are going to become object, meaning something we can look at and have a relationship to from the perspective of the subject of the next meaning-making stage. So whatever we're subject to looks like us. Whatever we can take as object looks like something that we can have a relationship to. It's this subject-object balance that changes and shifts when people mature and gain more perspective-taking capacities. This is why one of the most powerful things you can know, I'll put know in quotation marks because it's a model, but one of the most powerful things you can know about another human being is where they seem to be at the level of subject-object balance. What are they subject to? What can they take as objects? Or in other words, what's self and what's not self, right? So before we get to the self-authoring mind, or let's start there. To be able to have a self-authoring mind, you have to begin to take a step back from your own socialization, so to speak, your own peer group, your own profession, the assumptions of your own profession, your own family religion. You have to be able to take your own relationships as objects, to be able to take a step back and begin to decide for yourself what you think is important, what you value, what your standards are, what your limits are. To be able to have clear boundaries, for example. Because one reason why, in my mind, no one who doesn't have at least some solid self-authoring capacities shouldn't be doing change work is partially because of poor boundaries. People who haven't quite developed that capacity for self-authorship have a tendency to be simultaneously under-responsible and over-responsible. There's a tendency to literally feel as if other people are making us feel happy, or making us feel miserable, or that other people and events and objects are triggering us, as if we're just, experiencing an objective world that's just kind of being written all over us, right? This, of course, presupposes that I'm not quite able to see that no, it's actually me that constructs the meaning, that places the value on something, that evaluates something as good or bad or indifferent, so on and so forth. People who haven't quite developed self-authoring capacities will simultaneously, in addition to that victim role, have a tendency to be over-responsible on behalf of other people, to really think that they can make other people happy, or that they can directly make other people miserable. So it may be this martyr role, or trying to save other people, or a lot of guilt for other people feeling and being in a particular way. This again is a lack of solid, good boundaries. So let's backtrack a little bit. So if I'm no longer a child with magical thinking who's completely subject to his own perceptions and impulses, the earliest meaning-making stage in Keegan's model, and this corresponds quite well also with the opportunist stage in ego development, or the CP or RED system in spiral dynamics or Claire Graves' work, is a person who's subject to his own wants, wishes, and desires. So if I'm subject to my own wants, wishes, and desires, that means that my knowing of you, I'm going to know you and construct you through the filter of my own wishes, wants, and desires. You're going to essentially be a supplier to the self, meaning you're going to be valuable or not valuable depending upon what you can give me, right? So if I'm subject to my own wants, wishes, and desires, other people are suppliers to that very self. I am those desires. I am those wants. I am those wishes. So you're either going to be an obstacle in the way for me, or you're someone who may be a useful tool to satisfy some sort of short-term need, perceived need, short-term desire, short-term want. So at this stage of early adult developmental development, brain fart going on there suddenly, relationships have a tendency to be quite exploitative. They're quite exploitative. It's like a tit for tat. It's not like a shared intimacy. It's not like I'm even subject to seeing that I perceive people as suppliers to my own self. Like that's going to be who you are to me, right? Conflict then is going to be external, meaning it's other people and events that kind of trigger me. I don't really have much awareness of constructing my own experience. I'm going to be likely pretty chronically under-responsible because I don't really have a psychological self yet. There's really no sense of like a psychological self over time. So the future is just kind of the past that hasn't happened yet. So I may seem impulsive, even though impulsive is not really the right word, but I'm likely gonna lack in caring for stuff like long-term planning or consequences or taking other people that much into account, right? So if you're my friend, you're kind of like an extension of me, so to speak. Now you may now of course this meaning making stage is going to be is not adequate for like Western civilization. So the adults who are subject to their own wants, needs, and desires are overrepresented in like repeat offenders in the prison system, the long-term unemployed, people who can't quite make it in society, who are not really part of society because their meaning, their sense of self and their meaning making is not really up to par. It's an appropriate stage for a teenager to go through, but for an adult to operate here, that's something of a handicap. Now, a person who operates here, even though the thinking is black and white and without nuance and without much capacity for self-reflection, a person who operates here may be very smart in the conventional sense, may have a high IQ, might even be a genius, might have a special talent or some sort of skill or the right, family connections. Might have a Susan Cook-Reuter, another developmental psychologist, calls the people who operate here for opportunists, in that they may often have a kind of like unconventional ability to spot opportunities and to act on them because they don't have the kind of cognitive long-term thinking, consequence thinking constraints that many other people have. So they often just act, and this can have some big advantages as well. Now you may luck out. I'm not claiming that all people or even most people who operate here are criminals or doing anything wrong per se. You may have a person whose perceived needs, wants, and desires is to be a honorable human being, or to live out some other type of script, right? So you could still have a very decent human being. It's just a lack of perspective-taking skills and a very black and white thinking style. So there's a guy called Philip Lewis who wrote a book called The Discerning Heart, who has a very interesting example of this, where he writes about this young teenager who promptly walks across the street, right? And he takes this older woman, with her bags and like escorts her across the street to like a real gentleman. But of course, then the older woman says, I wasn't even looking to go anywhere. Like I wasn't thinking of going past the street, right? But that really wasn't of any concern to the young man because his need was to be nice or honorable or whatever. Chris Rock, the comedian, had a really funny saying. He said that a man is as faithful as his opportunities, or something like that, which may tell you a lot about Chris Rock, as his kind of projection. Now, of course, having done a lot of work with both females and males, I'd say, you could extend this to females as well. Now, if you don't just restrict this to sexuality, but you kind of restrict it all over the board, it's a nice like one-liner to kind of illuminate that opportunistic type mindset. Because if I operate from this stage of development, it's might is right, whatever you get away with. Guilt isn't really possible in the way we conventionally view guilt as this. Like, people who operate here, who are cheating on their partners, for example, may talk about being guilty, but the guilty is more like a fear of what someone else may do to them if they get caught. It's completely self-centered. My partner may leave me, or this may have bad consequences for me. I'm guilty. This is a way of conceptualizing guilt from an early meaning-making stage. So, thankfully, there are relatively few people, I think, who operate as therapists, coaches, and change artists who operate from this stage of development. They're not very psychologically inclined to begin with. So even though I'm pretty sure you have quite a few of them in like the pickup artist communities, and in quite a few of these power hypnotist short certifications, it's all about power and dominance, right? You can get some of these characters. But if you think about it, you can clearly see that someone who operates this way, whose selfing operates this way, this is not an operating system that is sufficient for doing good, consistent, quality change work as an agent of change, right? Now, of course, some people who may have evolved past this may look like this and revert to this a little bit under periods of stress. And then you have people with personality characteristics like psychopathy and high-level narcissism, which in many ways may look like this too, but it's kind of a different conversation. But let's say that I begin to take my own needs, wants, and desires as objects. I'm able to begin to look at them and have a relationship to them. This is developmental. So this may happen as a result of education, or joining the army, or religious teachings, or joining an athletic team where you begin to internalize other people's perceptions and perspectives, and you begin to kind of define yourself based upon it. So you become part of a community, and the community becomes part of you, right? So here people talk about being part of something bigger than themselves, to be part of something, right? This is what's called the socialized mind. So it may be part of an athletic team. It may be part of a religious teaching, part of a philosophy, But now, instead of viewing other people through exclusively my own wants, needs, and wishes, I internalize the norms of a society, the norms of a culture, the norms of religious teachings, or the teachings in the army, or whatever, or the teachings of NLP, or a particular school of psychotherapy, and I identify with it. So I kind of become identical to this ideology, and the ideology or the group becomes part of me, right? So here you in many ways have the foundation for a civilized society. You have a foundation for relationships that are no longer exploitative, but they're mutually enriching. So there's a mutual intimacy. It's not just, it's more a matter of like sharing experience. People may talk about, my better half. People may talk about self-sacrifice. Sacrificing now to achieve something later. Virtue, being a decent person. It's more likely to be at this stage of development, you can have sincere guilt. You can have sincere guilt. Your sense of self is largely derived from what you think other people expect you to be, like significant other people expect of you to be, and you kind of internalize that, and that becomes a huge basis for how you see yourself. So this is a person who's socialized, who can be a member of a group or a member of a society, and who can have loyalty to a group, to a relationship, to a society, to a set of teachings. This is more common for adults. This is also the home of the good German. You know, the good German who was part of the Nazi atrocities. The Stanley Milgram psychological experiments on obedience really catches this good German type thing. Here you have, in-group loyalty, my country, right or wrong, my church, my political party. The empathy and the loyalty towards the in-group is often matched by the hostility and the aggressiveness, towards those who are not like us, those who don't quite belong here. Here you also get, quite often these days, the values of political correctness and the virtue signaling, and the social justice warriors, and the people who are triggered and looking for safe spaces, and microaggressions. The people who talk about the devout true believer of anything. Now, if I begin to take a step back from my culture, from my religious teachings, from the philosophies I've been brought up with, and I take a step and I begin to take that as object, and I begin to really think for myself and to question those things and to develop my own inner seat of authority, now I'm beginning to develop more of those qualities that Keegan describes as the self-authoring mind. So I'll give an example. For the self-sovereign mind, the earliest stage, relationships are more exploitative. At the socialized mind, I kind of am my relationships, meaning I'm defined by them. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that a person who operates here necessarily cares for relationships. I mean, people have different personality tendencies, and they've been socialized into different ideologies, right? But I essentially am my relationships. So, for example, I once had a young Muslim woman who was a client who her parents, which is typical in the Muslim world, would not accept her having a boyfriend who was Norwegian. And her Norwegian boyfriend was kind of pressuring her to be honest and to be real about it. And she literally felt torn. She literally felt torn. Like the conflict, different significant others are kind of tearing me apart, by these expectancies. So you could say that she was her relationship. The person who has a more self-authored mind has the capacity to have some perspective on his relationships. He can take his relationships as objects, meaning he can have a relationship to his relationships. This may sound a bit cold and clinical, but there's actually more, developmentally speaking, there's more chances for intimacy at a self-authored stage than a socialized stage. So, according to Keegan and other researchers, The place in the Western world where you find more adults operating than anywhere else is in that transition between the socialized mind and the self-authored mind. Meaning most adults are not really self-authoring, pretty far from it. Like if you do this for a living, you'll see this every day. That most adults are far from self-authored. They're in between that socialized, self-authored space. And most of change work is about helping people move from that socialized space into a more self-authored space, right? To develop their own inner seat of authority. So why would a socialized mind not be really sufficient for doing good quality, consistent change work with a wide variety of people? Well, namely, the lack of proper boundaries. The tendency to be simultaneously under-responsible, as in outsourcing the source of one's experience to other people and situations and objects, and also being over-responsible, as in directly thinking of oneself as the source of other people's happiness or misery. This kind of unclear boundary is something you really need to sort out to be able to be a good agent of change. You need to have the good solid boundaries where you can own your own experience as your own and allow other people to have their experience. Because here's the thing, the socialized mind is constantly defining itself based upon how it thinks other people, especially significant people, are defining it. Now, this makes us more concerned with status and security and approval from other people. It makes us less able to really be relevant with another human being, because if you haven't quite developed those distinctions internally, it's hard to allow other people to have the psychological freedom to really be as they are if we kind of tend to define ourselves based upon how we think they think of us, right? You can see this very clearly when it comes to debates, for example, about free speech. To be able to really get free speech, you probably need a self-authored mind. I'm not claiming that everyone with a self-authored mind will be supporters of full free speech. There are other ways of viewing the world. But I'm saying that to be able to really support it and to really get it, you have to grant free speech to your opponents. Meaning you have to be able to grant free speech to people who think in ways you despise and who have attitudes that you think are beyond dignity or have no decency behind them, right? Anything else is hypocrisy. Now, if you're not quite able to own your own experience, letting other people be as they are, like letting other people be psychologically free to think the way they think and to think of you however they think of you, will often seem too threatening because we build a sense of self based upon it. So unless you have that self-authored mind, your boundaries are likely going to be too weak. And you're going to be engaging in way too much projection. So people at self-authored mind also engage in a lot of projection, but the earlier the meaning-making system, the less aware we are of how we kind of are meaning makers and project meaning. The less aware we are that what someone else seems to be saying and what we seem to be hearing don't necessarily map onto each other. So at the socialized mind, the noise, the signal to noise ratio is out of whack to be able to do good quality change work. I'm likely to hear too much that's never been said. And I'm likely to project way too much stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with the client. The more you evolve in this way, the less likely you are to do these things. So for example, if you see clients and you see clients who are really struggling, and this may also, if you see clients who are really struggling, that's going to kind of remind you of your own fears and your own, kind of shortcomings and blind spots. If you're not mature, you're going to have an inclination to save those clients, to compulsively have to save them. Not for the client's sake so much, but more for your own sake, to regain your own equilibrium, right? But this is not really in service of the client. Or if the client has a set of values or ways of thinking that are alien to you, you're going to be less likely to be able to kind of grant the client the freedom to be as psychologically weird or different or on a different developmental path than you are. Because again, it kind of revolves around you too much. Now, there's another stage too in Keegan's system, and relatively few people seem to be in that transition, but some people are. So remember that the self-authoring mind is kind of taking the socialization as object. So the person who is moving towards a self-transforming mind is beginning to take self-authorship as objects, to begin to take, identity formation and self-authorship and inner authority as objects, to be able to look at the selfing process. So at this stage, for example, the self-author mind has very clearly defined boundaries, of course. So like, this is me, this is how I am, this is how you are, and that's great. So conflict is still mostly about differences. Like we have different opinions. You and I have different personality tendencies, and that's kind of how we clash, and we can agree to disagree, and we can respect differences, and so on and so forth. The self-transforming mind has less dichotomies, and is able to self-reflect more in terms of seeing more of his own shadow elements. So now it's no longer so much about solving problems or solving conflicts. It's more about interesting problems or interesting conflicts solving you. Like, how can a relationship or an interesting problem or an interesting conflict solve you, solve your current sense of self, widen it, enlargen it? So if you have a conflict with someone else, then you may be more inclined to see that this other person may be holding one aspect of a polarity very strongly, and you may be holding the other aspect of a polarity very strongly. So it may be an opportunity for you to find more of what that person seems to be holding for you internally, so that you both kind of evolve in the relationship. That doesn't mean that you always have to do that. So for example, let's say that you're a psychologist or you're an agent of change. If you have a lot invested, for example, in being smart or being competent or being the one who knows, for example, you're going to be very easily projecting onto clients qualities and motives that seem to reinforce that brilliance in you. So now a client that seems to challenge you in a sense can be more exciting, because it can be an opportunity to let the client find more of those qualities in themselves, and for you to own more of the qualities that you project onto the client inside of you, right? So both of you can kind of evolve and grow and mature. So this is an argument for thinking developmentally. For those of you who know my work with the psychological illusion model, there's a lot of emphasis on seeing the illusory nature of the self, seeing the illusory nature of thought, waking up from these sorts of psychological illusions. But you can wake up quite a bit and simultaneously not be that grown up. So this is an argument for thinking developmentally and for working on your own capacities for perspective taking. So for example, if we go back to, let's look at, for example, the notion of responsibility. So the self-sovereign mind, the early adult stage of development, is pretty chronically under-responsible, right? It's a victim role. Now, if you operate from a more socialized form of mind, you may be very responsible, but its responsibility as determined by the boss or the organization or the industry standards or the society that you're a part of. Authority is kind of derived from a role, in the hierarchy or in the system. If you're going to do change work and if you're going to be self-authoring, that's not enough. You have to have the ability to for yourself determine your own role, your own framework. It's not enough to just follow a framework, whether it's a framework devised by Albert Ellis or Orrin Beck or Carl Rogers or Carl Jung or the professor at your local college. It's not enough to do that. You need to be able to step outside of these frameworks and not be had by them, to kind of be able to develop your own frameworks and to adapt it to that particular client. That's a self-authored capacity. Now, if you were to move beyond that to a kind of self-transforming capacity, you're talking about the capacity to take the frameworks that you operate out of, your ways of knowing as objects, and to be able to combine frameworks or adjust frameworks, adjust metaphors, adjust ways of knowing. It's a very different ballgame. Very few people in the world of change work seem to display those sorts of qualities at all. So hope this was provocative. Hope it was somewhat inspiring. If you're looking for someone to work with, you may want to kind of check and see if the person you're looking to work with seems to have these qualities. I'll leave you with this. Nassim Taleb, who's kind of a philosopher, economist, trader, author, he says something really interesting, which kind of it points to some personality tendencies and orientations, but I think it also points to something developmental. He says a good surgeon should not look like a surgeon. So he says that given the choice between a surgeon who really, like two surgeons who've both gone to medical school and they both had some success, right? But one of them really looks like a surgeon. He talks like one. He acts like one. He has all the mannerisms, like all the decorative is in order. And the other one maybe look more unkempt, have a look more like a butcher, fat fingers, may have a thick accent, may not seem to follow protocol in the same way. Taleb says, everything else being equal, I'd go for the butcher type, because he or she is likely less indoctrinated, likely has more perspective on his or her own profession, likely had to overcome more to be successful given given his preferences. So I highly recommend checking out Robert Keegan's book, In Over Our Heads, if this resonated. He writes kind of academically, so you may want to start out with the chapter that's titled "The Undiscussed Demands of Psychotherapy." It's a really good one. Now, if you want to get practical, my own book, it's called, my latest one, Provocative Suggestions. It's the first book that I know of that integrates Keegan's model, adult developmental psychology, with more NLP, hypnosis, psychotherapy, meditation-based approaches. So if you're looking for practical applications, go to provocativehypnosis.com and grab yourself a copy. All right, till next time, enjoy.